There is a hill above a bend in a muddy river, and on quiet nights, if the wind moves through the grass a certain way, it almost sounds like breathing. 28 centuries ago, nobody would have looked twice at this place. There was no marble here, no senate, no legions, no roads leading in every direction across a continent. There was only marsh and reeds, and a scattering of huts made from woven branches and mud. Sitting on hills above a river prone to flooding, shepherds moved their flocks along the ridge lines. Fishermen worked the shallows. Somewhere in the mist, a dog barked at nothing in particular, and the smoke from a dozen small fires drifted upward into a sky that had not yet heard the word Rome. We are going to sit with this place for a while. Not because it was extraordinary. At the time, it was not. But because almost everything that came afterward, every road, every aqueduct, every idea about law and citizenship and what a city could become, started here in mud among people who had no way of knowing what they were beginning. Let yourself settle in. There is no need to remember dates or names tonight. There is only the slow unfolding of a story that took 1,000 years to tell itself, and we have all the time in the world to listen. Before there was a Rome, there was simply Italy, though even that name belonged to the future. The peninsula that would one day carry an empire on its back was, in these early centuries, a patchwork of separate worlds, each shaped by its own soil and its own gods. To the north lay the valley of the Po, wide and fertile, populated by peoples the later Romans would call Gauls, tribes with their own language, their own customs, connected more closely to the world across the Alps than to anything forming in the south. Further inland, in the hill country of Etruria, lived a people whose origins remain even now genuinely uncertain. We call them the Etruscans. They built cities of considerable sophistication, walled, planned, wealthy from trade in metal and pottery, and they left behind an alphabet, a body of religious practice, and a great deal of art. What they did not leave behind in any surviving form is a literature we can fully translate. Much of what they believed about the world is lost to us, filtered only through the eyes of the Greeks and Romans, who came after and did not always understand what they were describing. South of the Etruscans, along the Tiber, sat a modest strip of territory called Latium, home to a cluster of related communities who spoke a common language, worshipped many of the same gods, and referred to themselves collectively as Latins. Their villages dotted the hills, Alba Longa, Lavinium, Tiber, and others whose names have mostly faded from memory. It was one small settlement among these, built on a defensible ridge above a river crossing, that would, against every reasonable expectation, outgrow them all. Further south still, along the coasts of the peninsula, Greek settlers had been arriving for generations, founding cities so numerous and so wealthy that the region came to be called Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Naples, Taranto, Syracuse on nearby Sicily, these were sophisticated urban centres with theatres, temples and philosophers, centuries before anyone in Latium had built anything resembling a public building of stone. It is worth pausing on this geography, because it explains something important. Rome did not rise in isolation. It rose at a crossroads, between Etruscan sophistication to the north, Greek civilization to the south, and the open, restless world of central Italy's hill tribes all around. Everything Rome would eventually become was assembled, piece by piece, borrowed and adapted and reforged, from the cultures pressing in on every side of it. The land itself mattered too. Central Italy is a country of hills, 7 of them clustered around the site of the future city, rising above marshy lowlands where the Tiber slowed and spread before reaching the sea. The soil was fertile enough for grain, for olives, for vines, though it demanded real labour. The climate brought hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters, good for a farmer's cycle of planting and harvest, but unforgiving of neglect. And the river itself, the Tiber, was navigable far enough inland to make trade possible, while shallow enough near the hills to be crossed on foot at certain points, which meant that whoever controlled that crossing controlled something valuable, a place where goods, people and ideas from the coast met those coming down from the interior. This is in the end the practical secret behind the founding of Rome. Long before any legend, someone recognized that a cluster of hills above a fordable river, close enough to the sea to trade but far enough inland to be defended, was simply a good place to live. Practical geography, not destiny, drew the earliest settlers here. Archaeology gives us something the myths cannot. A picture of ordinary daily life in the earliest days of this place, roughly the 9th and 8th centuries before our era, when the settlements on these hills were still small, scattered, and largely indistinguishable from 100 other hill villages across Latium. Picture a hut. Its walls are made from wattle, woven branches, plastered over with clay and straw. Its roof is thatch, sloped steeply to shed the winter rains, often topped with a chimney hole shaped almost like a small crown, letting smoke from the central hearth escape into the sky. Inside, the floor is packed earth, sometimes covered with rush matting. A family might live in a single room like this, sharing space with tools, stored grain, perhaps a loom for weaving wool. Excavated post holes from this era, some found beneath what would later become the very centre of Rome on the Palatine Hill, show us exactly this kind of structure, small and round or oval, clustered together in loose groups rather than anything resembling planned streets. Life followed the rhythm of the agricultural year. Spring brought the ploughing and planting of barley, wheat and beans. Summer brought the long labour of tending crops and pasturing sheep and goats on the surrounding hillsides. Autumn brought harvest, and with it, the pressing of grapes for wine and the gathering of acorns to fatten pigs before winter. Winter itself was a quieter season, a time for repairing tools, weaving cloth, and gathering close to the hearth as the days shortened. Food was simple, and by later Roman standards, quite plain. Porridge made from emmer wheat or barley formed the backbone of most meals, a dish the Romans would later call pulse, and which remained, even centuries afterward, a point of pride for a people who liked to remember that their ancestors had eaten humbly. Vegetables, cheese from goat and sheep milk, and bread supplemented this. Meat was a luxury reserved mostly for festivals and sacrifices, when a pig or a lamb might be slaughtered and shared among the community. Wine, watered down considerably, was common even among modest households, though the wealthy imported finer vintages from Greek trading ships that called at ports along the coast. Clothing, too, was practical rather than decorative. Wool spun and woven by the women of the household was the primary material, dyed when possible with plant-based colours, left undyed and simply woven when not. Men and women alike wore a basic tunic, and over it a length of cloth wrapped and draped in various ways, the earliest ancestor of what would later become the famous Roman toga, though in these early centuries it was worn by anyone who could afford the extra fabric, not reserved for citizens of status as it would eventually become. Religion touched every part of daily existence, though not yet in the grand temple-filled form it would later take. Early Latin religion centered on the spirits believed to inhabit particular places and moments. The hearth, the boundary stone between one family's land and another's, the doorway of the home, the fields at the moment of ploughing. Small household shrines, tended by the head of each family, honoured these spirits with simple offerings, a bit of grain, a splash of wine, a lock of wool. There were no grand priesthoods yet, no elaborate temples. Religion was, in these earliest days, primarily a family matter, woven into the texture of the everyday rather than separated into a distinct sacred sphere. We should sit with this picture for a moment, because it is easy, knowing what came later, to imagine early Rome as already special, as though grandeur was somehow visible on the horizon from the very beginning. It was not. These were farmers and shepherds, living much as their neighbours across Latium lived, worrying about rain and disease, and the safety of their herds, with no particular reason to believe their small cluster of huts would become anything more than it already was. And yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, something did begin to shift. Every civilization tells itself a story about its own birth, and Rome told several, layered, sometimes contradictory, endlessly retold and reshaped by later generations who needed the past to justify the present. The most famous version begins with twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, said to be descended from the royal line of Alba Longa and, through a more distant thread, from the Trojan hero Aeneas, who was believed to have fled the fall of Troy and eventually settled in Italy. According to this story, the twins were abandoned as infants on the orders of a usurping great-uncle, set adrift on the flooding Tiber in a basket. The river carried them to the base of the Palatine Hill, where the basket snagged in the roots of a fig tree. There, the legend says, a she-wolf found the crying infants and nursed them, until a shepherd named Faustulus discovered the scene and took the boys home to raise as his own. Grown to manhood, the twins eventually learned their true origins, overthrew the usurper, and set out to found a city of their own on the hills where they had been saved. But the brothers disagreed over which hill to build upon, over who held the right to rule, And in the most somber turn of the story, Romulus killed Remus, becoming sole founder of the city that would take his name. It is worth being honest about this story, in the spirit of separating memory from fact. Almost no serious historian believes the tale of Romulus and Remus describes real events. It reads, in most respects, like a foundation myth constructed after the fact, the kind of story cultures often build to explain their own existence, weaving together older folk legends about wolves and rivers and abandoned infants with the political needs of a much later era. When Roman writers wanted an origin story worthy of a great city, what we do know from archaeology rather than legend is considerably less dramatic, but in its own way more remarkable. Excavations on the Palatine Hill have revealed traces of a defensive wall and habitation dating to roughly the middle of the 8th century before our era, strikingly close, in fact, to the traditional founding date the Romans themselves later settled on, 753 BCE. This does not prove the myth true. It suggests instead that sometime around this period, the scattered hilltop villages of the region began to formalize, to build boundaries, to think of themselves as something more organized than loose clusters of huts. The most likely truth, pieced together from archaeology and comparative history, is this: Rome was not founded in a single dramatic act by a single legendary figure. It emerged gradually, over generations, as several small hilltop communities, on the Palatine, the Capitoline, and neighboring rises, slowly merged through alliance, intermarriage, and shared defense into a single larger settlement. This process, called Synoecism by historians who study similar patterns across the ancient Mediterranean, was common enough elsewhere in the Greek and Italian world. Villages banded together for safety and trade, and over time, the boundaries between them blurred until a single community, with a single identity, remained. The legend of Romulus, then, may be less a record of what happened and more a Roman explanation, crafted centuries later, of something they themselves no longer remembered clearly, a way of giving a human face and a dramatic story to a slow, quiet process of villages growing together into a town, and a town growing, in time, into something the world had never quite seen before. Whatever its true origins, the community that emerged on these hills in the 8th and 7th centuries before our era organized itself, according to its own later tradition, under a line of kings. Roman historians writing centuries afterward, men like Livy, working with sources far removed from the events themselves, recorded 7 kings ruling in succession, from Romulus through to a final ruler whose overthrow, they believed, gave birth to the Republic. We should hold this king list with some care. The first several kings blend uncomfortably close to legend, attributed with founding religious institutions, dividing the population into clans, and waging wars against neighbouring peoples in stories that often feel more like moral lessons than historical record. But by the time we reach the later kings, particularly those associated with the Etruscan dynasty said to have ruled Rome in its final royal century, the record becomes somewhat firmer, supported in places by archaeological evidence of genuine building projects, and by comparison with what we know of Etruscan civilization more broadly. It appears that at some point in the 7th or 6th century before our era, Rome came under significant Etruscan influence, perhaps even direct Etruscan rule. This was not conquest in a violent, dramatic sense, so much as the natural consequence of Rome's position on the frontier between Etruria and Latium. Etruscan civilization at this time was considerably more advanced than that of the Latin villages to the south, wealthier, more urbanized, more skilled in engineering, art, and religious ritual. It would not have been unusual for an ambitious Etruscan family, or a Latin ruler eager to adopt Etruscan sophistication, to bring Etruscan customs, craftsmen, and even rulers into Rome's growing community. Under this influence, the settlement began to transform in genuinely visible ways. The marshy valley between the hills, the area that would become the heart of the city, later known as the Forum, was drained through the construction of a great sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, portions of which, remarkably, still function beneath the streets of modern Rome today. Once drained, this central space became a gathering place, a market, eventually the political heart of the entire community. Temples in the Etruscan architectural style began to rise on the Capitoline Hill, most notably a great temple dedicated to Jupiter, built, according to tradition, by the last kings of Rome and dedicated at the dawn of the Republic that would soon replace them. The kings themselves in this era held considerable power, religious, military, and judicial authority combined in a single figure, advised by a council of elder heads of family called the Senate, a word derived from the Latin senex, meaning old man. This Senate did not yet hold the sweeping power it would later acquire under the Republic, but its existence, even under the kings, established a pattern that would define Roman governance for the rest of its history. Power divided, checked, and balanced between different bodies, rather than concentrated entirely in one set of hands. Roman tradition remembered the monarchy's final chapter with particular bitterness. The last king, Tarquin the Proud, was portrayed by later writers as a tyrant, arrogant, violent, contemptuous of the traditional rights and dignity of Rome's leading families. The specific story that ended his reign, whether entirely accurate or partly legendary, centers on an act of violence against a noblewoman named Lucretia, whose suicide after being assaulted by the king's son became, in the Roman telling, the spark that ignited rebellion. Led by a nobleman named Lucius Junius Brutus, the outraged Roman aristocracy rose up, expelled Tarquin and his family from the city, and swore, according to the story, on the very blade that had ended Lucretia's life, that Rome would never again be ruled by a king. Whatever the precise historical truth behind this dramatic tale, something real did happen around the end of the 6th century before our era. Etruscan influence over Rome receded. The monarchy ended, and in its place, Rome's leading families constructed something new, a system of shared, elected, and time-limited power that they called, simply, the res publica, the public thing, the republic. It is difficult to overstate how unusual this was for its time and place. Kingship was the default form of government across most of the ancient world. What Rome built instead, however messily, however unevenly applied across its own population in these early centuries, was a genuine experiment in distributed power, one that would evolve, argue with itself, nearly collapse more than once, and ultimately last for nearly 500 years before giving way, in turn, to something else entirely. Understanding how the Roman Republic actually functioned requires setting aside modern assumptions about democracy and instead picturing something considerably more layered, more unequal, and in its own way more intricate. At the top sat two consuls elected annually, who together held the executive power once concentrated in the king, command of the army, oversight of the state's affairs, the authority to convene the Senate and the popular assemblies. Crucially, there were two of them, not one, and each held the power to veto the actions of the other. This was entirely deliberate. Having watched what a single man with unchecked authority could become, Rome's founders built a system where power was, from the very start, deliberately fractured, so that no single individual could easily seize total control. Below the consuls, and growing more elaborate over the following centuries, developed a whole hierarchy of other elected offices: praetors handling judicial matters, quaestors managing finances, aediles overseeing public works and city markets, and eventually censors tasked with maintaining the official role of citizens and, notably, of the Senate's own membership. Each office carried a term limit, usually a single year, and most required a minimum age, creating what Romans called the cursus honorum, the course of honours, a structured career path that ambitious young men from leading families were expected to climb, rung by rung, gaining experience and demonstrating capability at each stage before advancing to the next. The Senate itself, drawn from the ranks of former magistrates and leading families, held no formal legislative power in the earliest republic. Technically, it could only advise, but in practice, given the enormous prestige, wealth, and accumulated experience of its members, its recommendations carried something close to the force of law. Meanwhile, the actual power to pass legislation, declare war, and elect magistrates rested with various popular assemblies, gatherings of Roman citizens organized into voting groups, though the exact structure of these assemblies, and how much real influence an ordinary citizen's vote actually carried within them, would become one of the great, recurring struggles of Roman political history. And this brings us to perhaps the central social conflict of the early republic, the divide between the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were members of a defined group of aristocratic families, tracing their status back, at least according to tradition, to the original senatorial families of the early city. They held a near monopoly on political office, religious priesthoods, and, crucially, on legal knowledge itself, since in these early centuries, Roman law was not written down in any form accessible to ordinary citizens. It existed as an oral tradition, interpreted and applied exclusively by patrician priests and magistrates, who could, and sometimes did, apply it selectively to their own advantage. The plebeians, meanwhile, comprised the vast majority of Rome's population: farmers, craftsmen, merchants, labourers, free citizens who nonetheless found themselves excluded from political power, vulnerable to arbitrary legal judgments, and increasingly burdened by debt. In the harsh economic reality of early Rome, a plebeian farmer who fell into debt, perhaps after a bad harvest or a period spent away on military campaign, could find himself and his family reduced to debt bondage, working for a wealthy creditor under conditions not far removed from slavery. The tension between these two groups, over the course of roughly 2 centuries following the founding of the Republic, produced what historians call the conflict of the orders, a long, largely non-violent struggle in which the plebeians, through collective action and, on several dramatic occasions, outright mass withdrawal from the city itself, gradually forced concession after concession from the patrician establishment. Imagine, for a moment, one of these moments of crisis. The city needs its citizen soldiers, as it always does in this era of near-constant local warfare. But the plebeians, weary of debt and legal abuse, simply walk away, marching out of Rome entirely and camping on a nearby hill, refusing to return, refusing to fight until their grievances are addressed. This tactic, known as the secessio plebis, the secession of the plebs, was used at least twice in Roman history with real effect, and it speaks to something important about the leverage ordinary people held in this society, even without formal political power. Rome could not function, could not defend itself, without the labour and the military service of its common citizens, and when those citizens withdrew that cooperation, even the most entrenched aristocracy had to listen. From this long struggle emerged a series of genuine institutional reforms. The office of tribune of the plebs was created, magistrates elected exclusively by the plebeians, holding the extraordinary power to veto the actions of virtually any other official, and considered so sacred to their protective function that harming a tribune was regarded as a form of sacrilege. Around the middle of the 5th century before our era, Roman law was finally written down and displayed publicly, in the form of the 12 Tables, ending the patrician monopoly on legal knowledge and giving every citizen, at least in principle, the ability to know what the law actually said. Over the following generations, restrictions on intermarriage between patricians and plebeians were lifted. Plebeians gained the right to hold the consulship and other major offices, and debt bondage itself was eventually abolished. None of this happened quickly, and none of it happened without real friction, resentment, and repeated crisis. But it happened, gradually, through negotiation and institutional reform, rather than revolutionary violence, and it left Rome with something distinctive. A political culture built around the expectation that conflict between different social groups should be resolved through compromise and formal process, however imperfectly, rather than through the wholesale destruction of one side by the other. This pattern, conflict, followed by gradual, grinding, often incomplete compromise, would recur again and again throughout Roman history, at every scale, from disputes between individual families to the great crises that would eventually bring the Republic itself to an end. But that story lies far ahead of us still. For now, in these early centuries, Rome was simply a mid-sized Italian city-state, its internal politics gradually stabilizing, its attention increasingly turning outward, toward the many other peoples who shared the Italian peninsula with it. It is worth remembering at this point in the story that early Republican Rome was not yet a great power. It was one Italian community among dozens, surrounded on every side by peoples who were in most respects its equals, sometimes its allies, sometimes its rivals, and periodically its enemies in wars that, from the outside, might have looked like nothing more than the ordinary, unremarkable friction of small states jostling for land, water rights, and prestige across a crowded peninsula. To the immediate south and east lay other Latin communities, bound to Rome by shared language and religion, organized loosely into what modern historians call the Latin League, a network of alliance and mutual obligation that provided military support in times of common threat, while each city retained its own independent government. Relations within this league were not always peaceful. Rome fought wars against fellow Latin cities on several occasions across these early centuries. gradually establishing itself as the League's dominant member, though this dominance was neither instant nor uncontested. To the north, the Etruscan cities remained wealthy, sophisticated, and, for a considerable stretch of the 5th and 4th centuries, a genuine military threat. The most significant of Rome's early wars was fought against the Etruscan city of Veii, a rival close enough to Rome, barely a day's walk away, that the two cities had likely competed for resources and territory for generations. According to Roman tradition, the siege of Veii lasted an extraordinary 10 years, a detail that later Roman writers, consciously or not, seem to have modelled on the legendary Greek siege of Troy. Whether or not the siege truly lasted a full decade, its conclusion, around 396 BCE, marked a genuine turning point. The destruction of Veii and the absorption of its territory nearly doubled the land under Roman control, and demonstrated for perhaps the first time that Rome possessed both the military capacity and the sheer persistence to overcome a serious rival through sustained, patient warfare. To the east and south, in the rugged hill country of the Apennines, lived a loose confederation of hardy mountain peoples the Romans called the Samnites. Tough, independent, skilled in the kind of flexible hill warfare that Rome's early armies, still organized in the dense Greek-style formations known as the phalanx, were not initially well equipped to fight. The wars against the Samnites, fought across several distinct conflicts spanning much of the 4th century and into the early 3rd, would prove to be some of the most difficult and formative struggles in Rome's early military history, forcing genuine tactical innovation and reshaping the Roman army into something new, organized into smaller, more flexible units called maniples, each capable of operating semi-independently on rough terrain, adapting to the enemy in front of it rather than remaining locked into a single rigid battle line. And then, in 390 BCE, or thereabouts, since exact dating from this era is genuinely uncertain, Rome suffered a catastrophe that would be remembered, with real dread, for centuries afterward. A large force of Gauls, migrating and raiding southward from the Po Valley, defeated a Roman army at the Battle of the Allia River and marched, largely unopposed, into Rome itself. The city, according to tradition, was sacked and burned. Most of its population fled or was killed. A small garrison held out on the Capitoline Hill, and the famous story survives, likely embellished, but rooted in genuine memory, that the sacred geese kept near the Temple of Juno raised the alarm one night when Gallic raiders attempted a stealth assault on the hill, honking loudly enough to wake the defenders and save the citadel from falling. Eventually, whether through paid ransom, negotiated withdrawal, or a combination of both, the Gauls departed, and Rome was left to rebuild from the ashes. This trauma left a lasting mark on the Roman psyche, a deep, persistent anxiety about the danger posed by peoples from the north that would echo through Roman policy and Roman imagination for centuries, resurfacing again and again in later wars, later fears, and later justifications for expansion. But rebuild Rome did. In the decades following the Gallic sack, the city not only recovered but accelerated its growth, expanding its territory, absorbing or allying with neighbouring communities, and steadily developing the military, legal and administrative tools that would allow it to do something no other Italian power had yet managed: unify the entire peninsula under a single system. It would be easy to imagine Rome's rise to dominance over Italy as a simple story of military conquest, of legions marching from city to city, crushing resistance, imposing rule by force. There was certainly warfare involved, a great deal of it, often brutal by any standard. But the deeper, more distinctive story of Roman expansion lies less in how Rome won its battles, and more in what it did after winning them. Consider what typically happened when a rival power conquered a neighbouring city in the ancient Mediterranean world. Often, the defeated population was enslaved, deported, or simply absorbed as a subject people, taxed and controlled but never truly integrated into the conquering state, forever treated as outsiders even generations later. This was the pattern followed by most ancient empires, from Assyria to, in certain respects, even Athens at the height of its own imperial reach. Rome, particularly from the 4th century onward, developed something genuinely different, and it is this innovation, arguably more than any battlefield tactic, that explains how a single mid-sized city eventually came to dominate an entire peninsula, and, eventually, a Mediterranean world. When Rome defeated and absorbed a neighbouring community, it frequently offered that community's population some form of Roman citizenship, sometimes full citizenship, with complete political rights, and sometimes a partial status, granting legal protections and the right to trade and marry within Roman law, without full voting rights, but with the clear expectation and pathway that fuller citizenship might follow in time, particularly for the community's own descendants. Other conquered peoples became formal allies, socially, bound to provide troops for Rome's armies, but retaining their own local government, laws and customs, while gaining Rome's protection and a share in the fruits of further conquest. This system, which modern historians often call the Roman model of incorporation, was not born from abstract generosity. It emerged in large part from hard necessity. Rome, throughout these centuries, faced near-constant warfare on multiple fronts and needed manpower, soldiers, far beyond what its own citizen population alone could supply. By offering conquered and allied peoples a genuine stake in Rome's continued success, whether through citizenship, legal protection, or a share of captured land and plunder, Rome transformed potential enemies into invested partners, whose sons would fight in Roman armies not merely out of coercion, but because Rome's fortune had, in a very real sense, become their own fortune too. It is worth pausing to imagine what this meant on an individual human level. A farmer in a small hill town, whose grandfather had fought against Rome and lost, might find himself, within a generation or two, holding a form of Roman legal status, his sons eligible to serve in Rome's legions, and share in the land grants that followed successful campaigns, his community's local government still largely intact and self-governing, his gods still worshipped in their traditional forms, layered now alongside a growing loyalty to Rome itself. This was not equality in any modern sense. Full political power remained concentrated in Rome and its own citizen body for a very long time yet, but it was a genuinely unusual and effective form of integration, one that steadily transformed former enemies into a widening network of stakeholders in Rome's continued expansion. By the early 3rd century before our era, following the long, hard-fought Samnite Wars and a further conflict against a coalition of southern Italian cities allied with the Greek king Pyrrhus of Epirus, whose costly victories against Rome gave the language a lasting phrase, the Pyrrhic victory, describing a win so costly it amounts to a defeat. Rome had achieved something no Italian power had managed before. It controlled, directly or through alliance, the entire Italian peninsula, from the Po Valley in the north to the Greek cities of the far south. And it was at precisely this moment, having become the master of Italy, that Rome's attention turned, almost inevitably, toward the sea, and toward a rival power whose wealth, whose navy, and whose reach across the western Mediterranean would soon draw Rome into the most dangerous and formative conflict of its early history. Across the narrow channel of water separating Sicily from the North African coast lay Carthage, a city considerably older than Rome itself, founded, according to tradition, by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre sometime in the 9th century before our era. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthage had grown into one of the wealthiest, most commercially sophisticated powers in the entire Mediterranean world, its influence extending across North Africa, southern Spain, Sardinia, and much of Sicily, sustained by a trading network and a navy that, at this point in history, comfortably outmatched anything Rome could put to sea. It is worth taking a moment to imagine Carthage as its own inhabitants might have experienced it, rather than only through the eyes of its later Roman conquerors, whose accounts, understandably, are not always generous. Carthage was a genuinely cosmopolitan trading city, its harbour filled with ships carrying silver from Spain, ivory and gold from Africa's interior, purple dye extracted painstakingly from a particular species of sea snail, a substance so labour-intensive to produce that cloth dyed with it became, across the ancient world, a marker of extraordinary wealth and status. Carthaginian merchants and sailors ranged further than almost any other ancient Mediterranean people, with some accounts suggesting voyages down the African coast and out into the Atlantic that, if accurate, represent extraordinary feats of ancient navigation. Carthage's government, like Rome's, was not a monarchy but a form of oligarchic republic, governed by elected magistrates called suffets and a council of wealthy, influential families, a structure that, on paper, bore genuine similarities to Rome's own senatorial system, even as the two cities' cultures, religions, and military traditions diverged sharply. For a considerable period, Rome and Carthage had coexisted without serious conflict, even signing several treaties across the 4th and early 3rd centuries defining their respective spheres of trade and influence. But Sicily, that large, fertile, strategically vital island sitting almost exactly between them, proved to be the friction point that neither city could ultimately avoid. In 264 BCE, a local conflict in the Sicilian city of Messina, involving a band of mercenaries who had seized control of the city and then found themselves squeezed between Carthaginian and local Sicilian pressure, spiraled into something far larger. Rome, invited to intervene by the mercenaries, sent forces to Sicily. Carthage, viewing this as an unacceptable Roman intrusion into what it considered its own sphere of influence, responded. And so began the First Punic War, Punic being the Roman term for anything Carthaginian, derived from Poeni, their word for the Phoenician descended people of Carthage, a conflict that would stretch on, with grinding intensity, for 23 years. This war forced Rome into an entirely unfamiliar arena. Rome, at this point in its history, had no meaningful navy to speak of. Its power had been built entirely on land, through its citizen-soldier legions and its network of Italian alliances. Carthage, by contrast, possessed one of the finest navies in the Mediterranean, crewed by generations of experienced sailors. And yet, in one of the more remarkable examples of institutional determination in the ancient world, Rome simply decided to build a navy from nothing, reportedly using a captured Carthaginian warship as a template to be copied and mass-produced, while training rowers on land on wooden benches arranged to mimic the interior of a ship before those same rowers had ever actually set foot on open water. It should not have worked, by any conventional expectation. And in truth, the early results were often disastrous. Roman fleets were lost not only to Carthaginian attack, but repeatedly to storms, the inexperienced Roman navy suffering catastrophic losses of ships and sailors on more than one occasion across the war's long course. But Rome's persistence proved in the end to be its defining advantage. Where other states might have sued for peace after a single devastating naval disaster, Rome simply built another fleet, and then, when that one too was lost, another again. This capacity to absorb repeated, staggering losses and continue fighting regardless, a trait that would recur again and again throughout Roman history, in wars still to come, gradually wore down even wealthy, sophisticated Carthage, until, in 241 BCE, exhausted and unable to continue funding the conflict, Carthage sued for peace, ceding Sicily to Roman control and paying a substantial war indemnity. The First Punic War left both powers bruised, but it left Carthage with a particular, simmering grievance. The sense of a war lost not through decisive defeat in the field, but through Rome's sheer stubborn capacity for endurance, combined with what many Carthaginians viewed as opportunistic Roman actions in the immediate aftermath, including the seizure of Sardinia during a moment of Carthaginian weakness, in clear violation of the spirit, if not always the precise letter of their peace agreement. It was in this atmosphere of resentment and unfinished business that a young Carthaginian commander began to rise to prominence in Spain, where Carthage, having lost Sicily and Sardinia, was rebuilding its power and its wealth through the conquest and administration of new territory. His name was Hannibal Barca, the son of Carthage's most successful general from the previous war, and he had, according to tradition, sworn as a boy, placing his hand upon a sacrificial altar at his father's insistence, an oath of eternal hostility toward Rome. Whatever the precise truth of that particular story, what followed was unmistakably real, and it would bring Rome, for the first and arguably only time in its history up to that point, to the genuine edge of total destruction. In 218 BCE, following a dispute over the Spanish city of Saguntum that both sides seemed to have recognized, in their own ways, as merely a pretext for a war that had been building for years, Hannibal made a decision that has been studied and admired by military strategists for over 2,000 years since. Rather than wait for Rome to bring the war to Carthaginian territory by sea, as had happened in the previous conflict, Hannibal marched an army, including, famously, a contingent of war elephants, overland from Spain, across southern Gaul and over the Alps themselves, descending into northern Italy to strike directly at the heart of Roman power. Try for a moment to imagine the sheer scale of this undertaking. An army of tens of thousands of soldiers, along with cavalry, pack animals and elephants entirely unsuited to mountain terrain, crossing some of the most difficult passes in Europe, likely in late autumn, facing not only the natural hazards of snow, ice, and narrow cliff paths, but also repeated attacks from hostile local tribes who harassed the column at its most vulnerable points along the route. Ancient sources suggest Hannibal lost a substantial portion of his force, perhaps close to half, to the hardships of this single crossing alone before he had fought a single battle against Rome itself. And yet he descended into Italy still commanding a formidable, battle-hardened army, and what followed was a series of catastrophic defeats for Rome that individually and collectively remain among the most studied disasters in military history. At the Battle of Trebia, and then more devastatingly at Lake Trasimene, where Hannibal ambushed an entire Roman army along a narrow lakeside road in thick morning fog, annihilating it almost completely, Rome suffered losses that would have broken most ancient states entirely. And then in 216 BCE came Cannae. At Cannae, in southern Italy, Hannibal faced a Roman army of unprecedented size, perhaps 80,000 men, the largest force Rome had ever assembled, and destroyed it almost entirely in a single day, using a tactical maneuver, a deliberate double envelopment, that has been taught in military academies ever since as one of the purest examples of tactical annihilation in recorded history. Roman casualties at Cannae are estimated, even by conservative modern historians, at somewhere between 50 and 70,000 men killed in a single afternoon, a scale of single-day loss that would not be matched in Western warfare for many centuries afterward. It is worth sitting briefly with the human dimension of this catastrophe, rather than only its tactical details. Every one of those tens of thousands of dead men was someone's son, in many cases someone's father, drawn from farms and towns across Italy, called up under Rome's system of citizen and allied military service that we discussed earlier. News of the defeat, when it reached Rome, reportedly produced scenes of raw public grief and terror, unlike anything the city had experienced before. Families gathering at the city gates for word of missing sons and husbands, the Senate debating, with real desperation, whether the city itself might now fall. And here, at this darkest moment, we encounter perhaps the single most defining trait in the entire arc of early Roman history. Rome did not surrender, where almost any other ancient Mediterranean state, having lost 3 major armies and tens of thousands of men in barely 2 years of warfare, might reasonably have sued for peace on whatever terms it could get. Rome instead raised new legions, in some cases enrolling men below the traditional minimum age or status requirements, and continued the war. Hannibal, meanwhile, despite his extraordinary tactical successes, found himself facing a strategic problem he could never quite solve. His hope in invading Italy had been that Rome's network of Italian allies, the very system of incorporation and alliance we discussed earlier, would fracture under the pressure of his victories, with allied cities defecting to Carthage and leaving Rome isolated and vulnerable. Some allies did indeed defect, particularly in the south, but the core of Rome's alliance system remarkably held firm. The very system Rome had built over the preceding century, treating conquered and allied peoples as genuine stakeholders rather than merely subjugated subjects, proved its worth precisely in the moment of maximum crisis, denying Hannibal the wholesale collapse of Roman power that his brilliant battlefield victories alone could not achieve. Unable to take the city of Rome itself, lacking the siege equipment, and, crucially, the reinforcement from Carthage that might have allowed a final decisive blow, Hannibal found himself instead settling into a long, grinding campaign across southern Italy that stretched on for over a decade, a war of attrition and manoeuvre rather than further dramatic pitched battles, while Rome, patiently and painfully, rebuilt its military strength and began, under a new generation of more cautious and capable commanders, to reclaim lost territory piece by piece. The eventual turning of the war came not primarily in Italy itself, but in Spain, and finally in Africa. A young Roman commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had lost both his father and his uncle in the Spanish campaigns against Carthage, proved himself an exceptionally capable general, first driving Carthaginian power out of Spain entirely, and then, in a bold strategic decision, carrying the war directly to Carthage's own homeland in North Africa, forcing the Carthaginian government, at long last, to recall Hannibal himself from Italy to defend the city of Carthage directly. The two commanders finally met in battle at Zama, near Carthage, in 202 BCE. Scipio, having studied Hannibal's tactics carefully over years of warfare against him, and having secured crucial cavalry support from a Numidian ally who had defected from Carthage's side, won a decisive victory, ending Hannibal's long, extraordinary campaign and bringing the Second Punic War to a close. The peace terms imposed on Carthage were severe: the loss of Spain, a crushing war indemnity to be paid over 50 years, and perhaps most significantly for the future, the effective end of Carthage's independent military power, forbidden from waging war even in self-defense without Roman permission. Carthage would survive for another half-century, rebuilding its commercial wealth even without its former military strength, before a final, deliberately provoked war in the mid-2nd century BCE would end the city's existence altogether. But that final chapter of Carthage's story lies a little further ahead of us. For now, let us simply register what the Second Punic War had done to Rome itself. It had tested the young republic more severely than anything in its history to this point, brought it to what genuinely appears to have been the edge of total collapse, and revealed, in the crucible of that testing, the qualities that would define Rome's rise for the next several centuries: an almost unnerving capacity for endurance, an alliance system robust enough to survive catastrophic military defeat, and an emerging generation of commanders and statesmen who had learned, through the hardest possible experience, how to fight and win a war on a scale far larger than anything the Mediterranean world had witnessed before. Rome, having survived Hannibal, would never again fight a purely defensive war for its own homeland. From this point onward, the story of Rome becomes increasingly a story of a power looking outward, across the sea, toward a wider Mediterranean world that it was, whether by ambition or by the sheer gravitational pull of its own success, about to draw into its orbit. Much of it had endured before Hannibal's war, and much of it had changed. The city that had trembled at news of Cannae was now, within a single generation, poised to become something entirely new. Not merely the dominant power of Italy, but a force whose reach was about to extend across the entire Mediterranean basin. Let the story continue to unfold gently, the way a river widens as it nears the sea. In the years immediately following the defeat of Hannibal, Rome's attention drifted, almost cautiously at first, toward the eastern Mediterranean, a world that Roman armies had scarcely touched until now, dominated instead by the great successor kingdoms that had emerged from the fractured empire of Alexander the Great over a century earlier. Macedon in the Greek north, and the Seleucid kingdom, stretching across much of the former Persian territories in the east, were the two great powers of this world, each ruled by dynasties that traced their legitimacy back to Alexander's own generals. Rome's involvement here did not begin as a plan of conquest. It began, as so much of Roman expansion did, almost reluctantly, drawn in by appeals from smaller Greek states seeking protection against the ambitions of their larger neighbours. Philip V of Macedon had allied himself with Hannibal during the darkest years of the Second Punic War, and this alliance, remembered with some bitterness in Rome, provided both a grievance and a pretext when, in 200 BCE, several Greek city-states appealed to Rome for help against renewed Macedonian aggression. The wars that followed, a series of conflicts against Macedon stretching across the early decades of the 2nd century BCE, revealed a Rome operating with newfound confidence on a stage it had never previously occupied. At the Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BCE, Roman legions, organised into their flexible maniple formations, defeated the traditional Macedonian phalanx in a battle that has often been read by later historians as something close to a demonstration of two different military philosophies meeting in direct contest: the rigid, powerful but inflexible mass of the phalanx against the adaptable small unit Roman system that could pivot and respond to broken or uneven terrain in ways the phalanx simply could not. What followed this victory tells us something important about how Rome, at this stage in its history, still understood its own role in the wider world. Rather than annexing Macedonian or Greek territory outright, the Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus proclaimed, at the Isthmian Games in Corinth in 196 BCE, before an assembled crowd of Greeks, the freedom of the Greek city-states from Macedonian control. Ancient accounts describe a scene of genuine, overwhelming emotion among the crowd. People weeping, pressing forward simply to touch the hand of the man who had, as they understood it, restored their liberty. We should read this moment with a certain amount of care. It was not in any simple sense pure Roman generosity. Rome's leading families understood perfectly well the value of being seen as liberators rather than conquerors, and the loyalty and goodwill this declaration purchased across the Greek world would prove immensely useful in the years ahead. But neither was it entirely cynical. Roman political culture at this stage genuinely did draw a distinction, however self-serving, between formal annexation and the exercise of what Romans increasingly came to call their auctoritas, a difficult word to translate precisely, encompassing something between authority, influence, and moral weight over allied and client states that remained, on paper, independent. This pattern would not last indefinitely. Over the following decades, as Rome fought further wars against Macedon and against the Seleucid king Antiochus III, who had made the mistake of extending his own ambitions into Greece and Asia Minor, just as Rome's attention was turning eastward, the balance gradually shifted from influence toward direct control. Macedon itself, after a final rebellion in the mid-2nd century BCE, was formally annexed and organized as a Roman province. The great Greek city of Corinth, once celebrated as the site of Flamininus's proclamation of freedom, was besieged, captured, and destroyed by Roman forces in 146 BCE, its population killed or enslaved, its treasures shipped back to Rome, in a brutal demonstration that the era of Roman restraint in the Greek world had come to a decisive end. That same year, 146 BCE, brought an even more consequential act of destruction, one that closed the door forever on Rome's oldest and most formidable rival. Carthage, in the decades following its defeat at Zama, had done exactly what its peace treaty with Rome allowed it to do. It had rebuilt itself commercially, its merchants and traders restoring much of the city's former wealth even without the military power to match it. This recovery, rather than reassuring Rome, seems instead to have unsettled a certain faction within the Roman Senate, most famously represented by the elder statesman Cato, who reportedly ended every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of its actual subject, with the same ominous phrase, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. We should be honest about what this reflects. There was, by the middle of the 2nd century BCE, no genuine military threat from Carthage, a city stripped of its army and navy by treaty, forbidden even from defending itself without Roman permission. What existed instead, in the minds of men like Cato, appears to have been something closer to lingering fear and resentment, the memory of Hannibal's invasion still vivid enough, even 2 generations later, that a wealthy independent Carthage, however militarily toothless in the present moment, remained intolerable to imagine. The pretext for a final war came in 149 BCE, when Carthage, provoked by encroachments from a neighbouring North African kingdom allied with Rome, finally took up arms in self-defence, a technical violation of its treaty obligations that Rome seized upon as justification for war. What followed was less a conventional military campaign than a slow, deliberate campaign of annihilation. Roman forces besieged the city of Carthage itself for roughly 3 years, and when the city finally fell in 146 BCE, the destruction was, by ancient standards, thorough and absolute. The city was burned. Its surviving population, reportedly numbering in the tens of thousands, was sold into slavery. Its territory was formally annexed as a Roman province. The old story, told for centuries afterward, that Roman forces sowed the ruined city's fields with salt to ensure nothing would ever grow there again, appears almost certainly to be a later invention, unsupported by any contemporary source. One of history's persistent legends that says less about what actually happened and more about how thoroughly Carthage's destruction was remembered as total and final. The truth needs no embellishment. A city that had stood for over 6 centuries, that had once rivaled Rome itself for dominance of the Western Mediterranean, ceased to exist within the span of a single year. It is worth sitting briefly with the discomfort of this moment rather than passing over it quickly. The story of Rome, told honestly, is not a story of uninterrupted virtue. It is a story of a genuinely remarkable political and social system, one capable of extraordinary resilience, integration, and institutional creativity, that was also, again and again, capable of extraordinary brutality when its own security, or simply its own ambition, seemed to demand it. Both of these truths belong in the same story, and neither one erases the other. By the close of this same eventful year, 146 BCE, with Carthage destroyed and Corinth burned, Rome had become, in the span of little more than half a century, the unquestioned dominant power of the entire Mediterranean world, a transformation so rapid and on such an unprecedented scale that it is worth pausing here to ask a question that Rome's own leading citizens were, at this very moment, beginning to ask themselves. What does a republic, built centuries earlier to govern a single Italian city-state, do when it suddenly finds itself governing an empire that spans an entire sea? The Rome that emerged from these wars of the 2nd century BCE was, in material terms, staggeringly wealthy compared to the Rome of even a century earlier. Conquered territories poured resources into the city, grain from Sicily and North Africa, silver from Spanish mines, art and treasure from the Greek East, and enormous numbers of enslaved people captured in these successive wars, who now laboured on farms, in households, and in workshops across Italy, in numbers far exceeding anything the peninsula had previously known. This transformation, however, did not benefit Roman society evenly, and its unequal effects would, over the following century, gradually tear at the fabric of the Republic's political stability in ways that its founders could scarcely have anticipated. Consider for a moment the experience of an ordinary Roman farming family in this era, the kind of small landholder whose sons had, for generations, formed the backbone of Rome's citizen legions. Military service in this period, particularly the long overseas campaigns increasingly required by Rome's expanding wars, could keep a man away from his farm for years at a stretch. A small family farm, without its primary labourer, often fell into debt or disrepair during these long absences. Meanwhile, wealthy senators and equestrians, a rising class of wealthy non-senatorial businessmen and financiers, were increasingly buying up struggling small farms and consolidating them into vast agricultural estates called latifundia, worked not by free tenant farmers but by the enormous new supply of enslaved labour flowing in from Rome's wars. The consequence, playing out across the Italian countryside over several generations, was a slow but steady displacement of Rome's traditional small farming class, the very citizens whose military service and whose political participation had underpinned the Republic's functioning since its earliest days. Many of these displaced families drifted toward Rome itself, swelling the city's population with an increasingly large body of landless, often unemployed urban poor, dependent on political patronage, occasional public grain distributions, and the shifting favour of ambitious politicians for their basic survival. It was into this widening social fracture that two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, stepped in the final decades of the 2nd century BCE, and their story marks, in the eyes of many historians, the genuine beginning of the crisis that would eventually consume the Republic itself. Tiberius Gracchus, elected as a tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, proposed a program of land reform aimed directly at this crisis, redistributing portions of Rome's public land, much of which had been informally but illegally occupied by wealthy families over the preceding generations, back to landless citizens, in an effort to rebuild the class of small independent farmers that had traditionally sustained both Rome's army and its political stability. The proposal, reasonable as it might sound in the abstract, provoked ferocious resistance from the senatorial elite, whose informal landholdings it directly threatened. What followed set a genuinely ominous precedent. Tiberius, in pursuing his reform through methods that stretched and arguably broke several unwritten norms of Roman political conduct, bypassing normal senatorial procedure, seeking an unprecedented second term as tribune, was, in 133 BCE, killed along with several hundred of his supporters by a mob of senators and their retainers, organised by his own cousin. It was the first instance of deadly political violence within the city of Rome itself in living memory, a shocking rupture of a political culture that had, for centuries, prided itself on resolving even its bitterest internal conflicts without bloodshed. A decade later, Tiberius's younger brother Gaius, pursuing a broader and more ambitious program of reform as tribune in his own right, addressing land distribution, subsidized grain for the urban poor, and expanded political rights for Rome's Italian allies, met a similarly violent end in 121 BCE, killed along with thousands of his supporters when the Senate, for the first time in Roman history, invoked what amounted to a state of emergency, authorizing the use of lethal force against a sitting Roman magistrate and Roman citizens. We should recognize the significance of this moment clearly. The Roman Republic, across its long history to this point, had weathered extraordinarily severe crises, foreign invasion, catastrophic military defeat, deep internal social conflict between patricians and plebeians, largely through negotiation, compromise, and institutional adaptation. The deaths of the Gracchi brothers marked something different. The moment when a significant faction within Rome's own political elite concluded that political violence rather than compromise was an acceptable tool for resolving internal disputes. Once that particular door had been opened, it would not close again. Over the following century it would swing wider and wider until it finally consumed the Republic itself. The final crisis of the Roman Republic cannot be understood without appreciating one further transformation, running alongside the social and political tensions we have just traced: the gradual, fateful change in the relationship between Rome's soldiers and Rome's state. For most of the Republic's history, the Roman army had been fundamentally a citizen militia, property-owning farmers, called up for a campaign season, expected to provide much of their own equipment, and returning home to their farms once the fighting was done. This system had worked more or less for centuries, but by the late 2nd century BCE, it was creaking badly under the strain of increasingly long, distant overseas campaigns, combined with the steady decline of the small landholding class we discussed a moment ago. The reforms traditionally credited to the general and statesman Gaius Marius around the end of the 2nd century BCE addressed this crisis directly, though likely built on gradual changes already underway. Marius opened military recruitment to Rome's landless citizens, men with no property to return to, no farm waiting for them, for whom military service was not a temporary civic duty interrupting an otherwise settled life, but rather a genuine career offering pay, plunder, and, crucially, the promise of land upon eventual discharge. This change made enormous practical sense for Rome's immediate military needs, providing a larger and more reliable pool of soldiers for its ever-expanding wars. But it carried a consequence that would prove in time deeply destabilizing to the Republic's political structure. Where soldiers had once looked primarily to the Roman state itself for their livelihood and their eventual land grants, they now increasingly looked to their own individual commanding generals, men who had the personal wealth, the political connections, and the practical ability to secure land grants and rewards for their veterans, often through direct negotiation or outright pressure applied to the Senate on their soldiers' behalf. The soldiers' primary loyalty, in other words, began to shift gradually away from the abstract institution of the Republic and toward the individual general who commanded him personally, and who alone seemed capable of securing his future welfare. Armies that had once belonged, in a meaningful sense, to Rome itself increasingly began to feel, in practice if not always yet in formal legal terms, like the personal instruments of ambitious individual commanders, men who now possessed, for the first time in Roman history, private military forces of a scale sufficient to seriously threaten the state's own institutions, should they ever choose to turn those forces against it. It did not take long for that threshold to be crossed. In 88 BCE, amid a bitter political dispute over command of a war against King Mithridates of Pontus in Asia Minor, the general Lucius Cornelius Sulla did something that would have been almost unthinkable a generation earlier. He marched his own legions into the city of Rome itself, using military force to settle what had, until that point, always been a purely political and legal dispute. It was the first time in Roman history that a Roman general had led Roman soldiers against Rome itself. The following years brought a grinding cycle of civil conflict, shifting alliances, and repeated purges as Sulla's opponents seized control of the city during his absence campaigning in the east, only for Sulla to return in 83 BCE, defeat his rivals in a further round of civil war, and have himself appointed dictator, an ancient Roman office, traditionally granted only in genuine emergencies and for strictly limited terms, that Sulla now held with essentially unlimited duration and authority, using it to conduct brutal proscriptions, published lists naming political enemies who could be legally killed, and whose property was then confiscated in a wave of violence and reprisal that touched thousands of Roman citizens across the city and the wider peninsula. Sulla, remarkably, eventually resigned his dictatorship voluntarily in 79 BCE, restoring, at least in formal terms, the Republic's traditional institutions before retiring from public life entirely and dying peacefully the following year. But the precedent he had set, that a sufficiently ambitious and militarily capable individual could seize total control of the state by force, hold it as long as he wished, and then simply choose to relinquish it or not, could never be fully undone. The Republic's institutions had survived Sulla's dictatorship in form, but something essential in the underlying political culture, the shared assumption that even the most bitter internal conflicts would be resolved through law and negotiation rather than armed force, had been broken in a way that would prove impossible to fully repair. Before we follow this unravelling political story any further, it is worth pausing, as we have at earlier points in our journey, to remember that all of this political and military drama unfolded above the heads of millions of ordinary people, whose daily lives, in this era of Rome's greatest expansion, looked rather different from the marble grandeur we sometimes imagine when we picture ancient Rome. By the 1st century BCE, the city of Rome itself had grown enormous by ancient standards, likely approaching or exceeding 1 million inhabitants by the time of the later Republic and early Empire, a scale of urban concentration that would not be matched again in Europe for well over 1,000 years. Most of this population did not live in the elegant townhouses of the wealthy, but in towering, often poorly built apartment blocks called insulae, sometimes rising 5 or 6 stories above the narrow, crowded streets, their upper floors cramped, dark, and genuinely dangerous, prone to collapse or catastrophic fire in a city where open flame for cooking and heating was a constant, unavoidable hazard in tightly packed wooden and mud brick construction. Imagine for a moment an ordinary family living on the 4th floor of one such building near the bustling markets of the city centre. Their apartment is likely a single or perhaps 2 small rooms, without running water, without any sanitation beyond shared latrine, or simply a chamber pot emptied, all too often, directly into the street below, a practice common enough that Roman law contains specific provisions addressing liability for injury caused by objects thrown or dropped from upper-story windows. Cooking, where it happens at all inside such cramped quarters, is done over small portable braziers, since open hearths in wooden buildings posed an obvious fire risk. More commonly, families simply purchased hot food from the countless small food stalls and shops, called thermopolia, that lined Roman streets, serving simple hot dishes of grain, legumes, and vegetables to a population that often lacked proper kitchen facilities of their own. The sounds of this world would have been extraordinary to modern ears grown used to relative urban quiet at night. The poet Juvenal, writing somewhat later but describing conditions that had likely existed for generations, complained bitterly of cart traffic legally restricted to nighttime hours within the city, meaning that the rumble of wooden wheels on stone, the shouts of drivers, and the general commotion of urban life continued deep into the night, making genuine rest a persistent challenge for ordinary Roman city dwellers in a way that stands in gentle irony against the peaceful sleep we hope this very telling might offer you now. For the very poor, and there were many in a city whose traditional agricultural economy had displaced so many small farmers, survival often depended heavily on the grain distributions that had become, since the reforms of Gaius Gracchus and subsequent politicians eager for popular support, a regular feature of Roman civic life, subsidized or, eventually, entirely free grain provided to eligible citizens. A policy that later Roman writers would describe, with a mixture of cynicism and genuine social insight, as part of a broader strategy of keeping the urban population content through bread and circuses, the circuses referring to the chariot races and public spectacles that provided the other essential pillar of popular entertainment and political goodwill. Slavery, meanwhile, touched nearly every level of Roman society in this period in ways that are difficult to overstate. The wars of conquest we have traced across this story had brought enormous numbers of captured people into Italy as enslaved labour, working the great agricultural estates we discussed earlier, labouring in mines and workshops, and serving in households ranging from modest to extraordinarily wealthy. Roman slavery was not organised around any single ethnic or racial category, as later slaveholding societies would be. Enslaved people in Rome might come from Gaul, Spain, Greece, Africa, or Asia Minor, their status determined entirely by capture, birth to an enslaved parent, or occasionally the settlement of debt, rather than by any inherited category of race. Manumission, the formal freeing of an enslaved person, was genuinely common by ancient standards, and freed people, called liberti, could become Roman citizens sometimes achieving considerable wealth and social standing, though a lingering social stigma regarding their origins typically remained attached to them for at least a generation. None of this made Roman slavery humane by any reasonable modern standard. Enslaved agricultural labourers on the great estates, in particular, often endured conditions of extraordinary brutality, and the sheer scale of human bondage underlying Rome's prosperity in this era represents one of the genuine, unavoidable moral shadows across this entire history. One more thread, alongside the destruction of Carthage and Corinth, that belongs honestly within the fuller telling of how Rome built what it built. Amid all of this, the crowded streets, the daily hustle of markets and workshops, the vast inequality between grand senatorial households and the crowded apartment blocks of the urban poor, ordinary religious and social life continued its steady rhythm. Households still maintained their small shrines to protective spirits, much as families had done in Rome's earliest, humblest centuries on these same 7 hills. Public festivals, dedicated to various gods and marking the turning points of the agricultural and civic year, punctuated the calendar with days of feasting, games and communal celebration, offering genuine moments of shared joy and respite from the mounting political turbulence unfolding meanwhile in the Senate House and in the increasingly militarized ambitions of Rome's leading men. It is against this vast layered backdrop of daily human life, millions of individual stories of work, family, worship and simple survival, that the final, dramatic act of the Republic's long story was about to unfold. In the decades following Sulla's dictatorship, Roman politics settled into an uneasy, temporary equilibrium, though the underlying tensions we have traced, the displaced farming class, the increasingly personal loyalty of soldiers to their generals, the growing willingness to resolve political disputes through force rather than negotiation, remained entirely unresolved, waiting beneath the surface for the next crisis to bring them boiling back up. That crisis arrived, in its most consequential form, through the emergence of 3 extraordinarily capable and ambitious men, whose informal alliance and eventual rivalry would, over the following 2 decades, finally bring the 5-century-old republic to its end. Gnaeus Pompeius, known to history as Pompey the Great, had risen to prominence as a brilliant young military commander, achieving a string of impressive victories, clearing the Mediterranean of the pirate fleets that had plagued Roman shipping and trade for years, and then conducting a sweeping campaign across the eastern Mediterranean that finally ended the long-running war against Mithridates of Pontus and reorganized much of the Roman East into new provinces and client kingdoms. By his mid-30s, Pompey had achieved a level of military glory and popular acclaim that would, in an earlier era of the Republic, have taken a Roman statesman an entire lengthy career to accumulate, if it were achievable at all. Marcus Licinius Crassus had built his own extraordinary position through a different route entirely. Sheer accumulated wealth, built partly through opportunistic property speculation during Sulla's proscriptions, and partly through shrewd, aggressive financial dealing, making him reputed to be the wealthiest man in Rome. Crassus had also achieved genuine military credibility of his own, most notably by finally crushing the massive slave uprising led by the gladiator Spartacus in 71 BCE, a rebellion that had, at its height, seen tens of thousands of enslaved people, under Spartacus's remarkable leadership, defeat several Roman armies before finally being cornered and destroyed, a conflict whose scale offers a stark reminder of just how vast and how volatile the enslaved population underpinning Roman prosperity had become by this one point. And then there was Gaius Julius Caesar, at this stage of the story, still a relatively young and ambitious politician, from an old but not especially wealthy or powerful patrician family, who had spent the years following Sulla's death building his political career carefully, through a combination of genuine oratorical skill, lavish public spending on popular entertainment that left him deeply in debt, and a keen understanding of how to cultivate popular support among Rome's ordinary citizens. In 60 BCE, these 3 men, each possessing something the others needed, Pompey's military prestige, Crassus's wealth, Caesar's political skill and popular following, formed an informal, private political alliance, later called by historians the First Triumvirate, agreeing to support one another's political ambitions and effectively dominate Roman politics through their combined influence, largely circumventing the Senate's traditional role in the process. It was through this alliance that Caesar secured, in 59 BCE, appointment to a 5-year military command in Gaul, the vast territory covering much of modern France and Belgium, home to numerous independent Gallic tribes, whom Rome had until this point engaged with primarily through trade and occasional diplomatic alliance, rather than direct conquest. What followed over the course of roughly 8 years was one of the most consequential military campaigns in Roman history. Caesar's systematic conquest of the whole of Gaul, a campaign he documented himself, with remarkable literary skill and equally remarkable self-promotional instinct, in his own written accounts, ensuring that news of his victories reached and impressed the Roman public back home with steady, carefully managed regularity. The Gallic campaign was, by any measure, extraordinarily brutal, even judged against the general standards of ancient warfare. Roman sources themselves, including Caesar's own accounts, describe campaigns that resulted in the deaths or enslavement of enormous numbers of Gallic people. Modern historians have estimated total losses from battle, massacre, and enslavement combined, potentially running into the hundreds of thousands across the full course of the war, though precise figures from ancient sources should always be treated with appropriate caution. Whatever the exact scale, the human cost was immense, and it purchased for Caesar something of tremendous value in the increasingly precarious world of Roman politics. An enormous, battle-hardened army of soldiers whose loyalty, following years of shared campaigning, victory, and plunder, belonged to Caesar personally in a way that echoed, and in some respects exceeded, the personal armies that Marius and Sulla had commanded a generation earlier. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the fragile alliance underpinning the triumvirate was beginning to fracture. Crassus, seeking military glory to match his two partners, led a Roman army into a disastrous campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east, where he and much of his force were destroyed at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, removing one of the 3 pillars holding the arrangement together. Pompey, meanwhile, had grown increasingly wary of Caesar's mounting power and popularity and drifted gradually toward closer alignment with the more conservative faction of the Senate, who viewed Caesar's growing personal army and popular following with genuine, and not unreasonable, alarm. By 49 BCE, with Caesar's term of command in Gaul drawing to its end, the Senate, under Pompey's increasing influence, moved to require Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen before seeking further political office, a demand that, given the extraordinary number of political enemies Caesar had accumulated over his career, would very likely have exposed him to prosecution, exile, or worse, stripped of the military force that had, until now, protected him. Caesar's response, in January of 49 BCE, produced one of the most famous moments in the entire span of Roman history. Standing at the Rubicon River, the small, otherwise unremarkable waterway marking the legal boundary beyond which a Roman general was forbidden to bring an army under arms into Italy proper, Caesar paused reportedly for some time, weighing a decision from which there could be no easy retreat, and then, according to tradition, uttering the words, "The die is cast," he led his legions across the river and into Italy, initiating a civil war against Pompey and the Senate's conservative faction that would determine, once and for all, whether the old institutions of the Republic could survive the ambitions of the men they had, in these final turbulent decades, produced. The civil war that followed moved with a speed that startled even contemporaries. Pompey, despite his own considerable military reputation, found himself unable to match the battle-hardened loyalty and tactical experience of Caesar's Gallic veterans, and withdrew from Italy entirely, eventually fleeing across the Mediterranean toward Egypt, where, in a final grim turn, he was murdered upon arrival by agents of the young Egyptian king Ptolemy XIII, who apparently hoped the act would curry favour with the evidently ascendant Caesar. Caesar, pursuing his rival to Egypt, arrived shortly after Pompey's death and became entangled, during his time there, in Egypt's own internal dynastic conflict, ultimately supporting Cleopatra VII in her struggle against her brother for the Egyptian throne, an alliance, and according to most ancient sources, a genuine personal relationship as well, that would have significant consequences for the still unfolding story of Rome in the years ahead. Over the following several years, Caesar systematically defeated the remaining pockets of senatorial and Pompeian resistance across the Mediterranean world, in North Africa, in Spain, wherever remaining loyalists to the old Republican order continued to resist. By 45 BCE, Caesar stood essentially unchallenged as the master of the entire Roman world, holding the position of dictator, as Sulla had once done, though Caesar's own approach to this extraordinary power differed from Sulla's in a crucial respect. Rather than eventually resigning his position and restoring the old order, Caesar appeared, to many of his contemporaries, to be moving steadily and deliberately toward permanent, unchecked personal rule, accepting the title of dictator for life in early 44 BCE, along with an accumulating array of honours and powers that increasingly resembled, in the eyes of many traditional Roman senators, the trappings of kingship itself, a form of rule that, we should remember, the Roman aristocracy had defined itself in opposition to, since the overthrow of Tarquin the Proud nearly 5 centuries earlier. It was this fear, genuine and widely shared among a significant faction of the Senate, that Caesar's accumulation of power represented not merely a temporary emergency measure, but the effective end of the Republic itself, that drove a conspiracy of senators, numbering perhaps 60 or more and led by men including Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, to assassinate Caesar in the Senate meeting hall on the Ides of March, the 15th day of March in 44 BCE. The conspirators, in planning and carrying out this act, appear to have genuinely believed, in a manner that reflects both their sincerity and their profound miscalculation, that removing Caesar would restore the traditional republic, that the Roman people and the Roman political system would simply return, gratefully, to the old order once the single individual threatening it had been eliminated. What followed instead was over a decade of further civil war, chaos, and, ultimately, the definitive end of the republican system the conspirators had hoped to save. Caesar's death left a genuine power vacuum, quickly contested by several parties. The conspirators themselves, still hoping to reassert senatorial authority. Mark Antony, Caesar's close ally and fellow consul, who moved quickly to position himself as Caesar's political heir, and, in a development few had anticipated, Caesar's own 18-year-old great-nephew and formerly adopted heir, a young man named Gaius Octavius, who would become known to history simply as Octavian. Few observers, in the immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination, would have predicted that this young, initially unproven heir would emerge, within little more than a decade, as the sole master of the entire Roman world. But Octavian proved to possess a rare combination of patience, ruthlessness, and political intelligence that allowed him to navigate the treacherous years that followed with remarkable, and to many contemporaries genuinely surprising success. Octavian first allied with the Senate against Mark Antony, then, upon defeating Antony's forces, reversed course entirely and formed his own alliance with Antony and a third figure, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, in what historians call the Second Triumvirate. This time, unlike Caesar's earlier informal arrangement, a legally sanctioned body granted formal, extraordinary governing power by the Senate itself, a telling sign of just how far traditional republican institutions had, by this point, been hollowed out in substance even where their outward forms persisted. This new triumvirate conducted its own brutal round of proscriptions, eliminating political enemies on a scale that, according to ancient sources, included even members of the triumvir's own families, sacrificed in exchange for the elimination of rivals belonging to their partners. Having defeated Caesar's assassins at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, the triumvirate's 3 members gradually turned against one another, as such arrangements built on shared ambition rather than genuine trust tend eventually to do. Lepidus was sidelined relatively early, stripped of his authority and allowed to live out his remaining years in obscurity. The final contest was between Octavian, controlling Rome and the western provinces, and Mark Antony, who had, in the eastern Mediterranean, formed both a political alliance and a celebrated romantic partnership with Cleopatra, the same Egyptian queen who had earlier aligned herself with Julius Caesar. This final conflict, cast by Octavian's skillful propaganda as a struggle not merely between 2 Roman rivals but between Roman virtue and the supposed decadent, foreign threat posed by an Egyptian queen who had in this telling seduced and corrupted a once great Roman general, culminated in the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, off the western coast of Greece, where Octavian's forces, under the skilled command of his close friend and Admiral Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, decisively defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. Both Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, and both, within the following year, took their own lives rather than face capture and the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as conquered enemies. With Antony's death, Egypt itself, the last great independent kingdom to have emerged from Alexander's fractured empire, and the source of an immense grain supply that had, for centuries, fed millions across the Mediterranean world, was annexed directly as Roman territory, and Octavian, not yet 33 years old, stood as the sole unchallenged master of the entire Roman world, the final survivor of 2 decades of relentless civil war that had, one by one, eliminated every rival who might have contested his position. Here we arrive, gently and without hurry, at one of the most genuinely fascinating turns in this entire long story. Not a battle, not a conquest, but a quiet, careful act of political reinvention that would determine the shape of Roman government for centuries to come. Octavian, unlike Julius Caesar before him, appears to have learned a crucial lesson from his adoptive father's fate. Caesar had accumulated visible, unmistakable personal power and honours that too closely resembled kingship, and this visibility, this open affront to republican sensibility, had gotten him killed. Octavian, by contrast, moved with considerably greater patience and subtlety. In 27 BCE, in a carefully staged act before the Senate, Octavian formally announced that he was relinquishing his extraordinary wartime powers and restoring authority to the Senate and the Roman people in a symbolic gesture toward the restoration of the old republican order that so many still, at least nominally, revered. The Senate, in response, whether through genuine gratitude, political calculation, or simple recognition of where actual power now resided, declined to accept this restoration in full, instead voting to grant Octavian a series of provinces to govern, control of the majority of Rome's military legions, and a new honorific title, Augustus, meaning something close to the revered one, a name carrying religious as well as political connotations, suggesting a figure blessed with a kind of favour from the gods themselves. Over the years that followed, Augustus, as he was now known, accumulated a careful, deliberately understated collection of powers and titles, the authority of a tribune, allowing him to protect and advance legislation, and eventually the powers of a provincial governor extending across virtually the entire empire, along with the title of princeps, meaning simply first citizen, a term that carefully avoided any suggestion of kingship, while nonetheless indicating a position of unmistakable primacy above all other Roman citizens. This careful architecture, blending genuine, comprehensive personal control over the Roman state with the outward preservation of traditional republican institutions. The Senate continued to meet. Consuls continued to be elected annually. Ancient religious offices continued to be filled according to established custom. Represents one of the most sophisticated pieces of political engineering in the ancient world. Augustus had found a way to hold what amounted to the powers of a monarch while carefully avoiding the word, the title, and the visible trappings that had cost his adoptive father his life. Historians, looking back, generally mark this transformation, formalized in 27 BCE, as the moment the Roman Republic effectively ended, and the Roman Empire, in its recognizable form, began. Even though, in the understanding of most Romans living through this transition, nothing so dramatic as the fall of one system and the birth of another would necessarily have seemed to be happening. Life continued. The Senate still met. The old titles and ceremonies persisted. It was in many ways less a dramatic collapse than a quiet, gradual settling into a new configuration of power, one that would prove remarkably durable for the centuries that followed. We should pause here and consider what this half-century of civil war and political transformation had actually cost, and what it had, in the end, produced. The republic that had governed Rome for nearly 500 years, that had built the intricate system of checks, balances, and shared power we explored earlier in this story, that had incorporated conquered peoples through citizenship rather than mere subjugation, that had survived Hannibal's invasion through sheer collective endurance. This republic had, in the end, proven unable to withstand the internal pressures generated by its own extraordinary success. The wealth and territory won through conquest had displaced its traditional farming class, created armies whose loyalty belonged to individual generals rather than the state itself, and produced a series of ambitious, exceptionally capable individuals, Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, and finally Octavian, whose personal rivalries, playing out across nearly a century, gradually eroded the shared political culture that had once made compromise, rather than violence, the Roman way of resolving disputes. And yet, out of this collapse, something new and, in its own way, remarkably stable had emerged. The Roman Empire that Augustus now presided over, however built upon the ashes of civil war, and however uncomfortable its relationship with the republican ideals it claimed still to honour, would go on to bring an extended period of relative internal peace to a Mediterranean world that had known almost constant warfare for generations. This peace, later celebrated by Roman writers as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, would allow trade, art, literature, and the ordinary rhythms of daily life across an enormous, diverse territory to flourish in ways that the endless civil conflict of the preceding century had made impossible. The story of that empire, its emperors, its provinces, its roads and cities and daily life, stretching from the mists of Britain to the deserts of Syria, its eventual challenges, transformations, and its own long gradual passage toward a different kind of ending many centuries later, is a story still waiting to be told, unfolding gradually the way all the best stories do, one quiet evening at a time. For now, let the image rest here, in this moment of transition. A single man, still young, standing before the Senate of Rome, gently, deliberately setting aside the outward symbols of the power he has, in truth already secured completely. Behind him lies 5 centuries of kings overthrown, plebeians and patricians slowly learning to share power, farmers and soldiers building an empire street by street and province by province, brothers murdered over land reform, and armies that learned, in the end, to follow men rather than the state those men had been sworn to serve. Ahead of him lies an empire that will endure, in one form or another, for centuries more, an empire built, as we have seen across this long unfolding story, not by any single stroke of destiny, but by countless small decisions, countless ordinary lives, countless moments of endurance and ambition and compromise, gathered slowly across the hills above a quiet, unremarkable river until they became something the ancient world had never quite seen before and would never entirely forget. But let us not leave him standing there, mid-gesture, without following him a little further into the world he was now so carefully assembling. The decisions Augustus made in the years following 27 BCE would shape not merely his own reign, but the basic architecture of Roman government for the better part of 3 centuries afterward, and it is worth lingering here a while longer, watching that architecture rise piece by careful piece. One of the more remarkable aspects of Augustus's long reign, he would govern in one capacity or another for over 4 decades until his death in 14 CE, is how much of it was devoted not to further conquest, though some certainly occurred, but to the patient, unglamorous work of institutional repair. A century of civil war had left Rome's administrative system strained, its finances uncertain, its army loyal to individuals rather than the state, and its provinces governed, in many cases, through a patchwork of inconsistent and often exploitative arrangements. Augustus set about addressing each of these problems with a thoroughness that suggests a genuinely careful, methodical temperament, quite different in character from the dramatic, high-stakes gambles that had defined the careers of Marius, Sulla, and Caesar before him. The army itself received perhaps the most consequential reform. Augustus reduced the sprawling number of legions that had accumulated during the civil wars. Many soldiers had, after all, fought on the losing side of one conflict or another and needed to be settled somewhere, down to a more manageable standing force, stationed permanently along the empire's frontiers rather than scattered under the personal command of ambitious individual generals. Soldiers now swore their oath of loyalty directly to the emperor himself, and crucially, their pay, their length of service, and their eventual retirement benefits, including land or cash payments, were now guaranteed by the state and administered through a newly created military treasury, rather than depending on the personal wealth or political influence of whichever general happened to command them. This single change addressed, more directly than any other reform, the precise mechanism that had driven decades of civil war, the personal loyalty of soldiers to their commanders rather than to Rome itself. It did not eliminate the danger of military intervention in politics entirely. The following centuries of imperial history would demonstrate that clearly enough. but it substantially reduced the everyday temptation for an ambitious general to march on Rome simply to secure his own soldiers' welfare. The provinces too received sustained attention. Under the Republic, provincial governorships had often been treated, quite openly, as opportunities for personal enrichment, with governors extracting as much wealth as possible from their territories during typically brief terms of office, with limited effective oversight or accountability. Augustus divided the provinces into two broad categories: those considered more stable, remaining under traditional senatorial governance, and those along more volatile frontiers, which came under Augustus's own direct control, governed by officials answerable to him personally. This arrangement allowed Augustus to maintain a close, direct hand over the empire's most militarily sensitive regions, while preserving, at least in appearance, a meaningful role for the Senate elsewhere. Provincial administration overall grew markedly more regularized and, by the often brutal standards of the ancient world, more accountable, with clearer systems of taxation and a functioning, if imperfect, avenue for provincial subjects to bring complaints of governor misconduct back to Rome for review. Rome itself, the city, underwent its own substantial transformation during these years. Augustus famously claimed in his own account of his achievements written near the end of his life to have found a city built largely of brick and left it built of marble, a boast that, while certainly exaggerated as a description of the entire city, does capture something genuine about the scale of public building undertaken during his reign. Temples were restored or newly constructed. A great forum bearing his own name was built adjoining the older Republican Forum. Aqueducts were extended and repaired to bring fresh water to a growing population, and a permanent organized fire brigade and police force, the Vigiles, were established for the first time, addressing the constant danger of fire and disorder that had long plagued the crowded, densely built city we described a little earlier in this story. For all the careful, deliberate calm that Augustus cultivated in his public presentation of Roman government, one persistent difficulty followed him throughout his reign and would continue to trouble his successors for generations afterward. The question of how power, having been so carefully gathered into the hands of a single individual, while formally still resting, in name, with the Senate and the Roman people, could ever be reliably and peacefully transferred to a successor. The old Republic had never needed to solve this problem, since its magistracies were elective and temporary by design. But the position Augustus now occupied, however carefully wrapped in Republican terminology, was not, in practice, an elected office with a fixed term. It was, in substance, a monarchy, and monarchies have always faced the delicate, often dangerous question of succession. Augustus spent much of his later reign attempting to identify and prepare a suitable heir, a task complicated repeatedly by misfortune. Several of his chosen successors, including his own nephew and later his grandsons, died before he did, from illness or accident, forcing him to adjust his plans more than once across the decades. Eventually, Augustus settled upon his stepson Tiberius, a capable and experienced military commander, though one whose own relationship with Augustus, and later with the wider Roman public, would prove considerably more strained and difficult than Augustus's own carefully cultivated popularity had been. When Augustus finally died in 14 CE, at the age of 75, Tiberius succeeded him with relatively little immediate disruption, itself a genuinely significant achievement, given how violently contested every previous transfer of supreme power in Rome had been across the preceding century. The arrangement Augustus had built, whatever its underlying tensions, had proven durable enough to survive its founder's death and pass, intact to a successor. It is worth taking a moment here to reflect on what daily life actually felt like for ordinary people across the vast territory now governed, however indirectly, from Rome, during these early decades of what would come to be called the Pax Romana. For a farmer in Gaul, a merchant in Syria, or a fisherman along the coast of North Africa, the distant political drama of emperors and senators in Rome likely mattered far less, in the texture of daily experience, than the more immediate and welcome fact that the endemic warfare of previous generations, the civil conflicts, the provincial rebellions, the piracy that had once made Mediterranean trade a genuinely dangerous undertaking, had substantially receded. Roads, built and maintained by the extraordinary Roman engineering corps, largely for military purposes, increasingly served as arteries of ordinary commerce and travel as well, connecting distant provinces to one another and to Rome itself with a level of ease and safety that the ancient world had rarely, if ever, achieved across so vast an area. Trade flourished under these conditions in ways that touched the daily lives of people who might never see a Roman soldier or hear a word of Latin spoken in their own communities. Grain from Egypt and North Africa fed the enormous population of Rome and other major cities. Wine from Italy and Gaul, pottery from workshops scattered across the Mediterranean, glassware, textiles, spices carried along trade routes stretching as far as India, and indirectly even China, moved along Roman roads and Roman sea lanes with a regularity that would not be matched again in the Mediterranean world for many centuries after Rome's eventual decline. A merchant in a provincial market town, examining pottery from a distant province or spices carried up from the Red Sea trade routes, was living, without necessarily reflecting on it, inside one of the genuinely remarkable achievements of the ancient world. An integrated economic zone spanning 3 continents, held together not by any single unified culture or language, but by Rhodes' law and the simple practical peace that Augustus's reforms had, however imperfectly, established. We have travelled a considerable distance together in this telling, from scattered huts on marshy hills above a nameless river, through kings and the birth of a republic, through the long, hard-fought unification of an entire peninsula, through the near catastrophe of Hannibal's invasion, and the difficult, sometimes brutal expansion across the Mediterranean world that followed, through the slow unravelling of republican institutions under the pressure of their own success, and finally to this quiet, carefully engineered transformation into something new, an empire wearing, for now, the comfortable, familiar clothing of the Republic it had actually replaced. It is worth noticing, as we pause here, how consistently this entire story has been shaped by a particular tension, returning again and again in different forms across each stage of the journey. The tension between what a society formally claims to be and what it has, through the accumulated weight of countless practical decisions, actually become. Rome called itself a republic governed by law and shared civic virtue, even as it built an empire through conquest and at times extraordinary violence. It called itself a society of small, self-sufficient farmer citizens, even as it increasingly depended on vast enslaved labour and a growing landless urban population. It called its first emperor merely the first citizen, even as he held, in practice, more comprehensive personal power than any king Rome had overthrown 5 centuries earlier. None of this makes Rome's story exceptional in the sense of being uniquely flawed among ancient civilizations. Most large, complex societies across history have carried similar tensions between their stated ideals and their lived realities. What makes Rome's version of this story worth telling at such length, and worth returning to across so many centuries of later human memory, is perhaps the sheer scale and duration of the experiment and the genuine ingenuity, alongside the genuine brutality, with which each stage of the journey was navigated. The empire that Augustus left behind at his death in 14 CE would, in the coming centuries, continue to change and adapt in ways that would have been difficult for even the most perceptive observer of that moment to fully anticipate. It would expand further under some later emperors and gradually contract under others. It would face internal crises of succession, occasional plague, and eventually the slow, complicated process of transformation and division that modern historians describe, with considerably more nuance than the old simple language of sudden fall once suggested, unfolding gradually across many generations rather than collapsing in any single dramatic moment. But all of that lies further down the long river of this story than we need travel tonight. For now, let the image of this moment rest gently in your mind. An empire at peace, roads stretching quietly toward every horizon, lamps being lit in cities and villages from Britain to Syria, and countless ordinary lives, unaware of how their small daily routines of work and family and rest were being carried along, gently and almost invisibly, inside something far larger than any one of them could ever have fully seen. Let your thoughts settle now, gently, the way the Roman evening settles over those same 7 hills as the lamps are lit one by one along quiet streets, and the long work of the day finally, gratefully, comes to its rest.